devastating summer of bushfires, the heat is on for action on climate change. We're told to do something, but what should we do? Jessie is an average income earner in outer suburban Melbourne. This is what she told a focus group.
Climate change is a real thing and a scary thought. I feel helpless about it at the moment. I recycle, I don't use one-use plastic, bring my own coffee cup. What more can I do to make a real difference? I think the repetitive language of climate change makes people shut off a bit. A sort of heard it before thing. I understand the need to close the coal power plants environmentally, but making sure we have measures in place to replace our energy supplies first might have been the smarter thing. I honestly don't know enough about it. Does renewable energy generate enough power to make a difference?
This is Big Ideas. I'm Paul Barclay. While the bushfires have galvanised public opinion here and abroad, concerns over climate change have long been simmering in Australia, as we heard from Jessie a moment ago. The polls suggest climate change is one of our top concerns, yet this hasn't translated into votes at the ballot box. Climate action parties and policies aren't winning elections, so why is there this gap between what we say and who we vote for? That's the question Rebecca Huntley sets out to answer in this Big Ideas. It was recorded at the end of November last year, at the beginning of what was to become a catastrophic bushfire season. Dr. Rebecca Huntley is one of our most experienced social researchers. She was formerly the director of the Mind and Mood Report, our longest-running measure of Australian attitudes and trends.
My task is to make sense of a situation that many of us must find bewildering. That there is now widespread public acceptance in Australia of the reality of climate change and the need for governments to respond. That we see daily, almost hourly reports that the long-predicted impacts of climate change have arrived in the form of record-breaking summers, extreme weather events, and sea level rises, and with it disruption to every aspect of our way of life, our food systems as well as our natural and built environments. Flying fruit bats fall from the sky in Campbelltown. Millions of perch and cod die in the Murray Basin. The Tuesday before last, not one drop of rain fell on Australian soil. New South Wales faced its first ever catastrophic fire event. We've had them in South Australia, we've had them in Victoria, we've had fires burn in Queensland. They're continuing to burn. When I left Sydney this morning, I couldn't see down my long street, and my daughter, who has asthma, we decided that she would need to stay indoors all day. These are the kinds of events usually reserved for sections of the Old Testament or increasingly for science fiction novels, and yet they're here. And yet rising concern about climate change and the environment in the social research has occurred simultaneously with the electorate voting for political parties with, how can we put it, recalcitrant policies on the environment, and with significant groups of climate deniers in their ranks. It's almost as if the people who answer the surveys aren't the same people who vote in elections. They are. Let's start to get to the bottom of this apparent dissonance between what people say they want and how they vote, particularly in an election like the last federal election that many commentators, myself included, thought would be the climate election. There are many reliable surveys documenting the rising level of concern in the electorate about climate change. So you've got the Australian Electoral Survey coming out of the Australian National University. It showed that between 2010 and 2013, belief that climate change posed a serious threat kind of flatlined, and then it increased sharply from about 52% to 62% from 2013 to 2016. And other surveys by companies such as Essential and Ipsos have found the trajectory of concern about climate continuing to trend upwards since 2016. However, it was the results from the Lowy Institute poll released a few months prior to the election that seemed to point towards the kind of escalating concern that might bring about a political shift akin to what happened in the 2007 election of Labor under Kevin Rudd. That Lowy poll showed 59% of Australians, up 5 points since the year before, agreed with this statement. Global warming is a serious and pressing problem about which we should begin taking steps now, even if it involves significant costs. A strong majority of Australians in that poll, 84%, up 3 points from the previous year, agree that the government should focus on renewables, even if this means we may need to invest more in infrastructure to make the system more reliable. Only 14% believed the government should focus on traditional energy sources, such as coal and gas, even if it means the environment may suffer to some extent. The Australia Institute's Climate of the Nation study, conducted after the election, found similar levels of rising concern, 81% of us agreeing that climate change will result in more droughts and flooding, up from 78% in 2018, and 78% that will lead to water shortages in our cities, again up from 2018. Roy Morgan released data just a few weeks ago showing environmental issues are seen as the biggest problem facing Australia, up a whopping 17% since June. We live in a world where there's a lot of surveys, and all of the surveys, and I didn't include them all in here, coming out every week, show that environment is extremely important, and even not just in surveys, but also coming up unprompted in research. So these surveys, while helpful in a general sense, only get us part way towards a deeper understanding of sentiment in the community on climate change. They are, and I say this as somebody who conducts surveys and makes a living doing so, they are of limited usefulness when thinking about two critically important issues. How do we tailor campaign messages effectively to people who are concerned about the environment but disengaged from the political system? And how do we translate this general concern, even though it's rising, into electoral gains for political parties with strong climate change policies? In order to get to this deeper understanding, I want to look at two pieces of research I haven't had a chance to talk about publicly until now. The first is a study that was commissioned by the World Wildlife Fund Australia, looking at both what happened in the last election and some qualitative work, which I'll talk about in a minute. WWF commissioned myself and Emilio Ferrer from Sphere Consulting to look at attitudes to a transition to renewables, specifically amongst Australians who didn't vote Labor or Green in the last election, but remained concerned about environmental issues. It seemed important both to WWF, and I was so pleased to do the research because it was important to me. I really wanted to understand what happened in that election with a serious look at the data. It was a pretty important prerequisite because there were a plethora of hot takes about why Labor lost the election, some of which were a bit dubious, I've got to say. So it involved looking at what the last census data tells us about every electorate in Australia in terms of its demographics. So is an electorate with more or less children per household than national average, higher or lower incomes, higher or lower education rates? Of course, we looked at location, so state and territory, as well as classifying each electorate as inner suburban, outer suburban, regional and rural. We then classified every single candidate in the 2019 and 2016 federal elections into two groups. So pro-environment, very broadly, comprising candidates who supported climate change policies, which are an improvement to those of the coalition. Some would say that's a low bar, but anyway, and other, comprising coalition candidates and other candidates who supported climate change policies similar or worse than those of the coalition. So furthermore, the pro-environment group was further classified into three groups: the Greens, the Labor Party and other pro-environment minor parties. And what we did is we analysed the swing between the 2016 and 2019 federal elections in each electorate, applying this classification of political parties, pro-environment and other. And what we found was at the 2019 election, pro-environment candidates obtained a little over 48% of the primary vote, and that result was 1.6% worse than in the 2016 election. This is significant because concern about environment has actually increased in that time. The performance of the pro-environment vote was worse in marginal seats, with a swing against it of 2.4%. The lowest pro-environment vote was found in Queensland, yes, Western Australia and New South Wales, where it obtained less than 50% of the vote. Queensland in particular only had a pro-environment vote of just over 38%. The most regionalised state in Australia, of course. The pro-environment vote was, unsurprisingly, low in rural electorates and regional electorates. Furthermore, the analysis found, and this is what's concerning for the Labor Party, the pro-environment vote was low in poorer electorates, electorates with older voters, electorates with more children per household than average, electorates with lower Year 10 completion rates, and electorates with lower tertiary education rates. Now, of course, an approach like this has its limitations. It's actually impossible from election data to conclude the reasoning behind why people vote, given it's determined by many factors. Exit polls, in my view, can't be relied upon. And even if you ask people now in focus groups why they voted the way they did in 2016, they may not be able to give you an accurate answer. There's a lot of revision of history when people think about why they voted a particular way. But for me, this analysis helps to highlight the profound challenges those of us involved in climate change communication and advocacy face. Poor Australians, young families, people living in rural and regional areas, Australians in a vulnerable position in the labour market, these are the cohorts who are and will be hardest hit by climate change. This signals a failure to communicate the full extent and urgency of climate change to the people who should care about it the most. The second piece of research worth looking at is the ABC's National Survey, Australia Talks. I was actually involved in the national survey that was the first phase of Australia Talks, which was conducted in June this year. After the election, 54,000 Australians completed that survey, and that was weighted to reflect the demographics of the population according to census data. That's an extraordinarily large sample. Most surveys that you would see published in the media are somewhere between 1,200 and maybe 1,500 people respond to those questions. So we had 54,000. There were 500 questions in that survey, with the content ranging from measuring attitudes to politics, health, education and technology, to behaviour around drugs and alcohol, sleep and commuting. It revealed that One Nation voters are twice as likely as any other group of voters to agree with the statement, "I would prefer to spend time with animals rather than people." I'm just not going to comment on that. I'll just leave that there. But for me, the value of Australia Talks is that it allows us to understand how different groups of Australians are responding to the climate change message. The most exciting finding from my point of view coming out of Australia Talks was that 72% of the respondents nominated climate change as the biggest issue facing them personally. Personally, and I emphasise that, they had a choice of 18 different issues to choose from. This was an extraordinary finding because one of the real difficulties up until this point has been connecting the issue of climate change to people's lives. In the research I've done leading up to this moment in the last 15 years, what I've found is that for some groups of Australians, climate change seems distant in time and it seems distant in space. It's something that will maybe impact future generations or communities in low-lying islands in the Pacific. So this personal aspect was really significant. The survey also asked about 26 specific issues, like which ones are most important to you as in terms of which you think are the biggest problems for Australia. And water and environment were at 89% and 81% respectively, but behind household debt and cost of living at 90%. So we are constantly told by political pundits that while voters say they are concerned about climate change, they narrow their scope of concern when they vote, with cost of living and debt, or whether or not you like the leader or not, trumping any concerns about the environment at the ballot box. Of course, life is going to get more expensive the less we do now about climate change. So there's an opportunity to connect cost of living, our standard of life, our way of life with climate change. But I'll talk a bit more about that later. Australia Talks also asked participants the extent to which they agreed with a series of statements on climate, and 60% agreed that it was a serious problem requiring immediate action, and 24% saying there's enough scientific evidence about climate to require some action. It also really drew a line through that really kind of disingenuous argument that we shouldn't do anything, Australia shouldn't do anything until China and the US act. And in fact, there was about 62% strong agreement and 17% agreement with the statement, Australia has a responsibility to act even if the other big polluting countries don't. So there, some good survey results, but like I said, doesn't necessarily get us all the way there. As we saw in the WWF post-election analysis, there are demographic and ideological differences evident beneath these big majorities of concern reflected in the Australia Talks data. So it's the good news, and then you start to dig down, you start to see where the challenges are. Where you live matters. People in Queensland and the Northern Territory, more conservative on environmental issues. There are the usual age and education curves in the Australia data, evident in pretty much every other survey I've ever seen in Australia on climate. The younger you are, the more educated you are, the more concerned and alarmed you are, the more supportive you are of immediate action. Interestingly, there aren't significant differences in terms of income. Education is always more important than income. And I was expecting to encounter some differences in terms of migrant status and ethnicity. They were there, but they weren't actually prominent. But I will say this, the environment movement on the whole is not predominantly white, but much of the prominent leadership is. There are these differences in migrant and cold communities on climate, and we should begin to think about how do we make sure that the leadership of the environment movement is as diverse as our population, especially since we know the impacts of climate change will not be felt, at least in the first instance, amongst wealthy white people living in the inner city. The greatest divisions showing up in the Australia Talks data, unsurprisingly, are political. Massive gaps between left and right voters. Combined with location, you can actually see how hard it is to shift the political map to reflect this general level of concern about climate. So if you've got conservative-leaning voters in states like Queensland and Western Australia, in regional areas of New South Wales, continuing to feel the way they do, it helps conservative governments with their recalcitrant policies remain in power, if only just. And yet the data also shows that all voter groups, every single one, even One Nation voters with their preference for animals rather than people, they all prefer renewables as a future source of energy, solar and wind. Support for more reliance on coal was in the single figures for every single voter group. But the real difference of opinion is actually on nuclear, with people, left-wing voters, minuscule support for nuclear energy and quite significant support for nuclear energy amongst conservative voters.
Social researcher Rebecca Huntley speaking at the University of Melbourne last November.
You're with Paul Barclay on RN, and this is Big Ideas, broadcast, podcast, and on the ABC Listen app.
For scientists, arguments about global warming are a matter of physics and chemistry, not so for many voters, according to Rebecca Huntley. Ideology and values define their response to climate change.
So I've thrown a whole lot of statistics and bits and pieces at you. What can we conclude from these two pieces of research as we dive underneath the general concern about climate change? Well, age and education differences aside, the issue of climate change has become a battle of ideologies, values and worldviews, something that has become much more pronounced in the last decade, thanks to our political class and to parts of the media. Knowing what we know about human beings, our psychological and evolutionary makeup, there is no evidence that these divisions are going to be broken down more by scientific evidence or just the passage of time, not that we have much time to spare. And we should be quite careful, assuming that as climate change becomes worse, these divisions will start to collapse. American journalist Nathaniel Rich wrote a fantastic book called Losing Earth, which talks about the decade where we could have dealt with climate change, which is basically the 1980s in the United States. And he writes, disasters alone will not revolutionise public opinion in the remaining time allotted to us. In addition, he also points out it no longer seems rational to assume that humanity, encountering an existential threat, will behave rationally. Instead, we need to better understand the irrational, ideological, psychological and cultural ways people respond to climate change, and a segmented approach to sentiment and behaviour is one way to do that. What do I mean by that? Well, I was lucky enough to spend some time in June of this year with researchers at the Yale program on climate change communication. And this program grew out of a groundbreaking conference on Americans and climate change, convened in 2005 in Aspen. And it's since then that program has conducted countless scientific studies on public opinion and behaviour around climate. And it's led by social scientists rather than natural scientists, but they've got a passionate interest in the natural world, and it resides within the renowned Yale School of Forestry. And much of what they do at the Yale program is informed by what they call their Six Americas study for segmentation, which was first conducted in 2009. So what this survey does, what this segmentation does, is it measures the American public, climate change beliefs, attitudes, risk perceptions, motivations, values, policy preferences, behaviours, including voting patterns and media consumption, and underlying barriers to action. The result of the survey work was it kind of came up with these 6 different citizens groupings or segments, varying in size and well differentiated in terms of their attitudes to climate change and their views about action. So on one end of the spectrum, we have the alarm. They've put it about 18%. Fully convinced of the reality and seriousness of climate change and already taking individual consumer and political action to address it. The actual larger segment is the concerned, which they put at about 33%, who are also convinced that the globe is warming and that it's a serious problem, but have not yet engaged with the issue personally, including not always voting for political parties with strong climate policies. There are 3 other groups: the cautious, the disengaged and the doubtful, representing different stages of understanding and acceptance of the problem, and none are actively involved. And finally, the dismissive 7%. Very sure that climate change is not happening, actively involved as opponents of a national effort to reduce emissions. Some of them are in significant positions of power in government, industry and the media. As someone who's spent about 15 years listening to Australians talk about climate change specifically and the environment more generally, this kind of segmented approach coming out of Yale kind of immediately resonated with me. It made sense. The qualitative research I've done over my time as a researcher has revealed the extent to which attitudes about climate are informed, not necessarily about an understanding about science or appreciation about science, but an understanding by worldview, values, political identification, social and cultural conditioning, and gender identity. So I contemplated this Six Americas study and I started to think about all my climate change work, so all the work I do for NGOs and other organisations on climate. And indeed, any time that I listen to any focus group or look at any survey about climate messages in reference to these kinds of segments. And in doing so, the task of the climate change movement was taking shape in my mind. We need to increase the alarmed cohort, absolutely no doubt, but we also need to develop and hone their skills of talking to others not of the same mindset. And we also need to provide them ongoing social and emotional support, as many of us, struggle with feelings of grief, dread and burning anger about what's happening to the planet and the response of many of our political leaders to the problem. We need to shift more of the concerned group, that's the largest cohort in the United States, but also in Australia and in many other countries in the world, into the alarmed group. We need to find a way to convince the cautious that urgent action is necessary. And this, very difficultly, often requires language that isn't fraught with tones of crisis and emergency because, in my experience, and I'll explain, presently it can backfire. We need to engage the disengaged. Now, that's probably the hardest task of all. Not necessarily through the issue of climate change per se, but by building their faith that our democratic institutions are capable and our elected representatives willing to do something about it. The doubtful may well be brought along in attempts to convince the other groups, if not with the science and the extent of the threat, but with the solutions to the problem, namely the opportunity for Australia to become a renewable energy superpower. And finally, and I say this with no trepidation whatsoever, we need to drive the dismissive group out of positions of power in our government, stop the flow of their donations into our political parties, and find smarter ways to engage with them in the media, including social media. So there actually is an Australian version of the Six Americas study, which is worth looking at very briefly now because it's really excellent. It was led by Donald W. Hine from the University of New England and colleagues from that institution and Griffith University. And they took a kind of similar approach to the Yale study and came up with 5 groups, which are pretty much the same as the Yale groups without the disengaged group. It was conducted in 2013, and that's a long time ago given what's happened then both politically and atmospherically. However, the Hine approach is highly valuable because what it does even more than the Yale approach is it takes into account a much broader range of cognitive and emotional factors that underpin human responses to climate change. One of them is how close do people feel to climate change effects? Do they see local manifestations or not? And do they identify them as being connected to climate change? Do they feel an emotional connection to nature? How much do they trust climate change authorities or authorities in general? And how much do their self-reported feelings of shame, guilt, anger and fear condition them to respond in certain ways to the climate change issue and remain open or closed to solutions? So these are now the questions I ask myself in the process of developing, conducting and analysing any research on climate change, whether that be qualitative or quantitative. Understanding and using this segmented approach to research on climate sentiment has allowed me to improve the quality of work I do for environmental NGOs and the networks that now make up the bulk of my clients. I've spent a lot of time in the last 18 months in particular wondering about the efficacy of the language around climate change, around emergency, crisis and urgency. The facts of climate change and the need for rapid response absolutely merit these terms. To not use them seems to be more than a sin of omission, but an outright lie to the public about the scale of the threat and what's at stake. The notion of kind of a total war has been used as a concept to reflect the level of social change and collaboration needed to respond to climate change. In my quarterly essay earlier this year, I evoked this image myself and I wrote, "The hard and urgent task of placing environmental concerns at the centre of our democratic project requires more than just new laws and better enforcement, more solar panels and less plastic bags. It requires a whole of society approach to addressing the climate crisis, the kind of mobilisation of people and communities, assets and resources, governments and infrastructure, usually reserved for a world war." Going back to those segments, those in the alarmed group feel more than comfortable with this war footing message. The dismissive, those who we would normally describe as deniers, are also strangely comfortable with this language. Not because they agree with the position, but because they believe and fear that climate activists are agitating for a reorganisation of the power structures in our society via this complete mobilisation. Both groups are temperamentally, or whatever you would say, kind of psychologically, more comfortable with conflict than other people. And interestingly, more on the cynical scale than the optimistic scale. We're going to go down that direction as well. Some of the concerned group respond well to messages of urgency and others not so well. But for those who are disengaged and cautious, I've seen how the language around crisis and emergency can actually turn them off and away from engagement with climate change and actually make them less concerned and more critical of attempts to address climate effects. I observed this quite clearly in the second stage of the work I did for WWF on renewables and the transition away from coal. We conducted a number of online focus groups with men and women in outer suburban Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. I really wanted to focus on those outer suburban areas because, as we saw in the election analysis, they, particularly in marginal seats, really swung away from those pro-environment candidates. For these groups, we recruited people with lower levels of formal education, self-identified swinging voters who had not voted Labor or Greens in the 2019 election, but described themselves as concerned or somewhat concerned about the environment. So we really wanted a mixture of concerned, disengaged, cautious and doubtful voters living in outer metropolitan areas. And of course, as the outer metropolitan areas of all our big cities are, ethnically diverse. While there was a spectrum of attitudes to climate change, energy and politics, there were some really common findings across these groups. These men and women had a strong sense of national pride. They were patriotic and optimistic about this country. How good is Australia? Pretty good. I actually threw that out in the conversation as a joke and they did not take it as a joke. They went off about how great Australia was. Well, not so much a joke as a kind of a, throwaway line. Their cares and concerns were local and immediate, secure and well-paid jobs, safe neighbourhoods, a good standard of living and happy, successful kids. Security was a big theme and participants saw signs that lack of respect was undermining social norms, threatening their sense of security. While there was a general acceptance of the climate science, they saw it more as a future threat and not an immediate and not personal threat. They, importantly, rarely discuss climate change in their daily lives. It seems we can talk about politics and sex, but not climate change, how mores change. There was a strong belief that climate change was overplayed by the media and politicised. They disliked aspects of the climate change discussion, including its negative gloom and doom tone, its remote and inaccessible language, and the fact they felt guilty and depressed when listening to climate change messages. When confronted with the scientifically proven 10-year timeline for change, their reaction was explosive. Scare tactics, that can't be true, where's the evidence? The more we tested messages that focused on the 10-year time frame and the connections between climate and catastrophic events, the more they pushed back. When it came to energy, the preference was overwhelmingly for renewable energy over coal. They wanted affordability and reliability, but they wanted this transition. But they kept questioning how fast should it proceed and what will be the cost for society to be able to do that. Now, we tested about 9 messages around energy transition with this group, and almost every single one of them fell flat, except for one. They disliked all of them. The one that they liked was a relentlessly positive message, solutions-focused, about how clever Australians have come up with inventions like Wi-Fi and how we could be world leaders in renewable energy, allowing us to generate jobs and address rising cost of living pressures.
Social analyst Dr. Rebecca Huntley on the challenge of communicating the reality of climate change.
This research has made me think more and more about the Australians, probably spread across the kind of mildly concerned to the disengaged and cautious, that no change has to come, but are anxious about the shape, pace and negative outcomes of that change. They rightfully question whether our political and business leaders have the capacity or the desire to ensure that this transition to an economy built not on fossil fuels but renewables doesn't penalise already struggling groups in our society. I want to just read out some comments by one particular person in one of these focus groups, a school teacher. Her name was Jessie, and she was living in the outer suburbs of Melbourne, the western suburbs, and this is what she had to say. It really encapsulates some of what I've talked about thus far. She said, "Climate change is a real thing and a scary thought. I feel helpless about it at the moment. I recycle. I don't use one-use plastic, bring my own coffee cup. What more can I do to make a real difference? I think the repetitive language of climate change makes people shut off a bit. A sort of heard it before thing. Relevancy is a big part. Am I personally affected in this moment, or is it something I don't have to care about for a while? I understand the need to close the coal power plants environmentally, but making sure we have measures in place to replace our energy supplies first might have been the smarter thing. I honestly don't know enough about it. Does renewable energy generate enough power to make a difference?" Now, Jessie was full of genuine and open questions. These were open questions, not closed ones. She wasn't critical of the climate science. She believed it. But what we can do to address what she rightfully defines as a real and scary thought, a world transformed by climate change, was something that she just kept going back to. What can we do? What can we do? She also did what is often happening in focus groups that I conduct at the moment, is somehow equating plastics recycling with climate change. I don't blame her. Our Prime Minister did that at the UN, so she's in good company. But what I think is that there's been an enormous, successful with the war on waste and this focus on plastics recycling. But as we can make great leaps and bounds with plastics recycling, and it's not going to do much to do with climate change. And the muddying of those two issues for me is something of great concern. The lessons for me from this project with WWF, and I was very honoured to do it for them, in addition to all the work I've done thus far on climate, these are lessons that are well understood by climate communicators around the world in theory, but not always put into practice in every campaign. Those lessons are: be solution-focused and positive. Understand the values of people you are trying to convince. Do not fuel division and conflict. Relate solutions to climate change to our sources of happiness and common concern. And more importantly, never assume that what messages work for you will work for others. These are just some of the principles for communicating on climate contained in what I have to say is the must-read book by UK activist George Marshall. It's called Don't Even Think About It. It was published in 2014. He's one of the leading experts on climate change communications globally. He argues that climate change contains none of the clear signals that we require to mobilise our inbuilt sense of threat. and that one of the limitations of a narrative built on either the war metaphor or those on crisis and emergency is that they can be overwhelmed by negativity, pessimism and conflict. He argues, and I agree, that the challenge is how we activate cooperative values rather than competitive values. Stress what we have in common, namely secure and well-paid jobs, safe neighbourhoods, a good standard of living and healthy, successful kids, the desire for security and happiness, whatever that might look like for different groups of people. Both the Yale and Hine segmentations consider trust in government, trust in climate science and climate authorities to actually be vitally important when trying to understand why people respond to climate change messages the way they do. If you think about the 6 segments and you talk about people who are doubtful and people who are dismissive, the difference between somebody doubtful on climate change and somebody dismissive, in my experience, is they sound the same, but when they say, where's the evidence, and you put in front of them something like, well, this is what the CSIRO says, the doubtful person goes, okay, and the denier says the CSIRO is riddled with communists. So my experience is that deniers play the man and not the bull and think the man is a communist. That's generally the way that I think about it playing out in focus groups. So this whole idea of trust, whether it be in authorities and academics and scientists in government, is actually critical to this question. Denialists have cynically capitalised on people's growing distrust in institutions of all kinds, their contempt for politicians, in their campaign to undermine the climate science. Why should you trust government experts or professional politicians like Al Gore? They want to take away your ute and force you to drive expensive electric cars, to go to vegan hamburger joints and, all in the name of science, which is uncertain, etc. So I've got to say my slightly sarcastic humour here is not directed at the people who drive the utes or the people who eat the vegan hamburgers, but the political and media elites on the far right who position themselves as champions of the common people in public while undermining any government with policies that might actually benefit those constituencies. I did not join in with the post-election trolling of Queenslanders or the characterisation of people who resist climate messages as mean and stupid bogans. I agree with the French philosopher Bruno Latour when he writes in his brilliant book Down to Earth, Politics in the New Climatic Regime, before accusing the people of no longer believing in anything, one ought to measure the effect of that overwhelming betrayal on people's level of trust. Trust has been abandoned along the wayside. No attested knowledge can stand on its own, as we know very well. Facts remain robust only when they are supported by a common culture, by institutions that can be trusted, by a more or less decent public life, by a more or less reliable media. In my quarterly essay, I explored the issue of trust in democracy and government as part of a larger argument that the urgent social, economic and political issues facing us as a nation and concerning the electorate were acute enough to encourage Australians to vote for a wildly unpopular leader with a policy platform based on strong social democratic values with an environmental issues at its core. Didn't that turn out well? In my response to my own essay, written the weekend of the election result, I reflected on my errors of judgment. If I was to approach my essay again, I wrote, it would be focused almost entirely through the lens of public distrust of politics, because if there was one big message coming from this election result that we have had this year, it is that despite our voting record, Australians are alienated from the system. Before anyone speculates on how people responded to the ALP's policies, we first need to ask, were people listening much in the first place? There were many signs they weren't. The high number of pre-poll votes, 4.7 million. It's extraordinary. It keeps going up every year. Driven, of course, by a desire for convenience, but we can't all have children playing football or having some kind of operation on election day. It has to reflect that people have made up their minds before the campaign even started. It's as if the campaign is completely irrelevant to their decision-making. This is not good. It's not good for our democracy, and it certainly should have indicated that there were no real conditions for change. The conclusion I drew in my QE response was not that Australia is no longer progressive or no longer cares about equality or climate change or is becoming like America, or indeed that all social research lacks credibility. The conclusion is that the lack of trust the electorate have in politics have undermined their belief that structural reform, whether that be economic, social or environmental, is not something that can be delivered by the current crop of politicians running the show, by a political class that thinks it's okay to have Aldi bags full of cash in the office. While rebuilding our faith in the political system is a long and arduous process, I want you all to take heart. This is my optimistic bit. We in Australia are well positioned to do this. Support for compulsory voting, interestingly, remains strong despite peak cynicism, and all the research continues to show that Australians favour a central role for government in our lives. In fact, if our governments get their act together to deal effectively with climate change, this could do much to build trust in the community that they have our best interests at heart, both in the short and the long term. It could do much to help boost our flagging democratic spirits, particularly amongst the younger generation of voters, who can only remember the revolving door of prime ministers, many of them undone over climate and energy policies. I spoke earlier about the need to find ways to shift those in the large concern segment into the alarmed cohort. And I have an anecdote to share with you in conclusion about this, about how this can happen, not from any research report or academic study, but from a moment in my own recent past. On December the 1st, 2018, I woke up, I made myself a cup of coffee and I turned on the TV. I switched straight to my favourite early morning news and current affairs show and saw hundreds of teenagers skipping school and protesting in the streets about climate change. And they were holding these handmade signs with slogans that span from the serious and angry to the humorous and profane. There are no jobs on a dead planet. Act now or swim later. You're burning our future. And my favourite sign of the protest, why should we go to school if you won't listen to the educated? As I sat sipping my coffee, I thought to myself, well, good on those kids telling the powers that be, that older generation, they need to do more about climate change. And then it hit me. At almost 50 years of age, I'm part of that older generation, part of that generation with a platform and a voice some of these young people don't have yet. It was at that moment as if those teenagers, their signs both funny and dramatic, were speaking to me. Do something. And just then something shifted inside me, a sensation hard to describe, and yet I can recall it now with clarity. It actually felt physical. I felt like they were telling me to do something. And so I made a decision at that moment to make my work, my life as a parent, as a consumer, as a citizen, in every decision I make about the research jobs I will accept, about the energy that I will have in my house, about the transport that I will take, about the food that I will eat, and about where I will invest my superannuation. Looking back at this moment as a social researcher rather than a person, what's obvious to me and fascinating is that watching these young protesters on the street didn't mean I suddenly believed the climate consensus more than I did the day before. But it's clear that environmental concern was not actually at the centre of my worldview. So I'd registered it rationally but not emotionally. And so this transformative moment, the moment I tipped from concerned about climate change to genuinely alarmed about the threat, didn't happen because I read an ICC report or sat through a presentation from a climate scientist about CO2 levels. I reacted to a crowd of children holding up signs in the streets. Girls, and the movement is often led by girls, were only a few years older than my eldest daughter, and suddenly it became very personal. That I can make a contribution to this movement, probably the most important in our history, is such a relief to me and helps me manage the angst that overwhelms me from time to time in the night as I ponder how best to equip myself, my children, my community, our nation for the challenges already on our doorstep. Now comes the final, the inevitable, the all-important call to action. Your first task, my first task, is how we maintain our enthusiasm and optimism, which includes our own mental health and well-being, as we move deeper into a climate change-affected future. We can protest, we can change the terms of our super fund, install solar panels, vote for parties with strong climate policies, or any climate policies really. But one of the most important things you can do is understand why people who aren't like you feel the way they do about climate change and learn to talk to them effectively. What we need are thousands, millions of everyday conversations about climate change. That will help enlarge the ranks of the concerned engage the disengaged, and make the cautious more convinced of the need for action. This will then expose those who dismiss both the science and the solutions, the denialists, who are today a minority, albeit a powerful one, as what they are, out of step with the rest of us, determined to put our collective well-being and our way of life at risk. We must not let their voices be the loudest in the public arena. We must create a chorus of different communities, united in asking, indeed demanding, that we act now to preserve a livable world and a viable future. Thank you.
Big ideas on RN, broadcast, podcast, and on the ABC Listen app.
You stay there.
Climate change is forcing us to look at everything we do, to weigh up the carbon emissions. But does this mean a pet dog or a cat is a luxury we can't afford? Dogs and cats are carnivores, and meat production produces a lot of greenhouse gas. You can change your own diet to eat more plants, but is there an alternative for your meat-eating pet? That's the focus of this discussion, broadcast last year from the University of Sydney and moderated by Dr. Bidder Jones from the RSPCA. The speakers are Dr. Roger Bektash from the pet food industry, Dr. Michelle Shaw, a nutritionist at Taronga Zoo, Dr. Anne Fawcett, a lecturer in veterinary practice at Sydney Uni, and also from Sydney University, Professor David Raubenheimer, who specialises in nutritional ecology.
The major impact has to do with food production. Not the only impact, but potentially the major impact has to do with food production. Human food production, either for ourselves or for our companion animals, is probably the major contributor to environmental degradation on this planet. The proportion of that goes to pets, dogs and cats alone is massive. Recent publications for the United States calculations have suggested that American dogs and cats eat 20% of the energy as American humans do. And what type of energy makes a big difference, because the production of animal-based foods is much more demanding on the environment than the production of plant-based foods. And unfortunately, we took a wrong turn way back about 40,000 years ago in history in domesticating carnivores rather than herbivores. And what that means is that a disproportionately large proportion of the energy that our pets eat comes from animal source products. So that is the short answer. The long answer is that to calculate exactly how much we can attribute directly to the feeding of our pets is a complicated thing to do.
Roger, perhaps you could help us understand what exactly goes into pet food and what measures the industry perhaps is already taking to tackle this problem.
It's undoubted that all of us as living species, we're consuming food, and that has an impact, its production has an impact on the environment. A critical thing, and something that makes me proud to be part of the pet food industry, is we seek to complement rather than compete with the human food chain. So primarily, the proteins, the carbohydrates that we use for pet food are made up of byproducts of either animal production or cereal production, and uses parts of the animal or parts of grains which we choose not to eat. We could eat, they have good nutritional value. So in many ways, the pet food industry is a reprocessor or a scavenger that takes valuable proteins and carbohydrates and reformulates those into the pet foods you're familiar with. But those origins are primarily not parts of the animal or parts of grains which we would choose to eat.
Do you think that food waste isn't such a problem in the pet food industry as it is in the food production industry?
That's an interesting question, because it starts from the ingredients for pet food. So we're using ingredients which we choose not to eat. Wastage then is as a matter of how that product is distributed and consumed. And overfeeding, such that he either overeats, which is not healthy, or leaves behind a lot of food, then that's food waste, as it is for us. And that can happen, and does happen, I think, unfortunately, in a lot of pet dogs and cats who are treated very well, but become overweight. I think there's a lot of synergies with human health and behaviours.
Michelle, I understand with your work as a zoo nutritionist, you're looking out for novel ingredients that might help reduce the environmental impact of the food that's being fed to animals. How do you go about figuring out what are good substitutes and the health implications that might have?
Well, it is really tricky because I'm dealing with lions and tigers and capybara instead of dogs and cats. But I rely really heavily on the research that's been done in the pet food industry and the livestock industry to design those diets. Our vision at Drongoes is to secure a shared future for people and wildlife. So obviously it's something that is part of every decision that we make. Sustainability and looking at the environmental impact is a big part of that. So I'm always looking for local products. I'm looking for agricultural byproducts that we can use in our diets. But I'm also looking to the pet food industry and what's being used there. It's just that when I'm feeding the animals at the zoo, I recognize that if I'm feeding an elephant, I'm basing a lot of the diet formulation on what I know about horses. And so I'm always aware when I'm using these products that I'm kind of using it off-label. So I'm using it for species that they weren't intended for. So I'm always aware of what kind of nutrition-related problems that we may have because we're feeding species that these diets weren't intended for, and they may have species-specific nutrient requirements that are different, and that's what a lot of my research is trying to find out what those differences are and feed them for the specific animals that we have. But we're always looking for new ingredients, and just because there is a possible risk doesn't mean that I'm not willing to balance and try to find one of those win-win diets, like to have something that is actually a benefit to the animal and mitigate some of our environmental impact at the zoo. Animal food is the second largest contributor to our carbon footprint at Taronga. We're spending $1.7 million a year on animal food, and that obviously has a big impact. So it's something that it's very complex, as David was saying. It's very, very difficult to determine what that impact is. And carbon footprint is just a small picture of that, but it's something that's continuously factored in, something that we revisit again and again and again with all of the diets.
So in terms of the welfare implications of how the animal products have been obtained for food that we're feeding to pets, should we be more concerned about feeding food that contains meat from, say, kangaroos than meat that's produced from intensively farmed chickens or grass-fed cattle? What do we think about the humane production and the treatment of the animals that are actually going into this food?
I think it's very important, and I think there's increasing interest by pet owners who are recognizing that they love animals. On the one hand, they want to look after their companion. On the other hand, they want to make sure the food they feed doesn't have a huge animal welfare footprint. I think this is something that people are growing awareness about. You don't want to help one animal and by doing so harm others in the process. The difficulty is there's a lack of transparency in a lot of the production chains, so people really don't have a way of going to a pet food, say commercial pet food, and reading a label and looking at an animal welfare footprint. There's not a sort of a quality assurance scheme as there are for some products that are made for human consumption. And I think that's an area where pet food manufacturers can really take a leadership role, and there's going to be increasing demand from consumers to have animal welfare friendly food products for their companion animals.
Reducing your carbon footprint and keeping a pet. Can you do both? You can find the link to the full program on our webpage or via the ABC Listen app. You've been listening to Big Ideas. I'm Paul Barclay.
There you go. 2.5 millimetres. So now we know who's been voting to do nothing about anthropogenic global warming and who's been voting to make it worse. And why. And we also know that bowerbirds enjoy Vita-Wheats, but they prefer multigrain bread. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. springs eternal in the drought struck. Arboreal, heart, bonus extra footage, I suppose. Ciao.